Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Let's go.
Yep, waiting for the recording to start. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd talk a little bit about the repercussions of events in the Ukraine. Austin, it looks like Africa is going to be suffering some severe food shortages, right?
Dan, parts of Africa already suffer from severe food shortages, or to be more accurate, poor food distribution, because you've got the food resources, but it's very difficult getting it to the malnourished, who may be malnourished simply because they're poor and the weather's been bad, but frequently it's because of violence and wars and displacement. And this is something, if you go back and look at the third edition of A Quick and Dirty Guide to War, Jim and I put together in what came out in '96, I think there's a discussion about the displacement in Africa, and it's by war and violence, and then the what we'll call a secondary and tertiary effects of people dying from exposure and starvation. Again, it's not news if you think back into the 1980s, all the starving in Ethiopia and like. But what is a critical factor, and I can't say this is being ignored, even though look back, I believe it came up in January in one of our podcasts where I mentioned Black Sea wheat. It may have been in February, and this is Turkey was already scrambling for other sources of food, or making sure that they had the money to buy grain. Part of it in Turkey's case at the time was their own inflation and their currency problems. But Russia is the world's largest exporter of grain. Ukraine is, I think, fourth largest. But Ukraine, a lot of Ukraine's production is bought by the World Food Program. I'm not sure of what the exact percentage is. And it goes into a World Food Program operations. It's not all in sub-Saharan Africa, but that's where it's particularly critical to make up for either crop failures or, and as in the case I said, the chaos from war and displacement. That's just that's been part of the deal. And I think Canada's number 2 in exports, and U.S. is number 3. Those don't line up, Dan, with absolute production. China, I think, leads the world in grain production, but they consume it all themselves. India is number 2. And then now you get into, I think we're number 3. U.S. is number 3. And Ukraine, Canada, somewhere in there. For Canada and the U.S., it's more than enough for domestic purposes, and ours it can be exported or given away. But in Ukraine and Russia, I know Russia makes most of its money from oil and gas and selling resources, but a huge chunk of its exports are in grains. Now, when you analyze who is dependent on it, you're already into these, when your leading question was right on the mark, you're into these fragile places that are already living on the edge. And we can start running them off: Central African Republic, parts of Burundi. Rwanda's fairly stable right now, but then the thing is look at also all the other global inflation. Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania's kind of okay. Mozambique isn't. Malawi and Zambia are vulnerable. Zimbabwe is dependent on it. Sudan, even though Sudan has enormous agricultural potential and productivity, Southern Sudan is dependent really on the World Food Program. Ethiopia could do it, but it's still locked into a civil war. And there I'm just going to places in Central Africa, and of course Congo has food resources, but they're uneven. And the East, which Jim and I talk about occasionally on Strategy Page, where the Kivus and Ituri province are just a complete mess. But that's not here to say that, it's just a sub-Saharan African problem. No, after I did that research on Turkey and Black Sea wheat, and there was an article I read about other grain buyers in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. You go right through the list of petropowers in the Persian Gulf. They've got money, but they buy a lot of wheat from Ukraine and Russia. Syria is the same. Egypt's got tons of agricultural production itself, but they still buy. And right on across the North African littoral. And there are other Asian countries that still, they have a deficit, even though they produce wheat, corn, rice. There's a deficit, domestic deficit. So they rely on the exporters. And Russia and Ukraine, it's been good business for both of them. Now, what do we have? Let me add one other component. The war also has affected global petroleum supplies. And as a result, we've already seen here in the United States what's happened, and a lot of this has to do with our restrictions on domestic oil and gas production. But a rise in fertilizer prices, and a rise in just flat in gasoline and diesel fuel prices, and it makes it more expensive to farm, and even on smaller plots. And here's one of America's built-in strengths. I mean, the U.S. and Canada have the Great Plains, and think about it: Russia, Ukraine, fabulous places to grow grain and soils on it. But it's still, to produce that requires a system that has access to water, fertilizer, and then so the power to plant and then harvest. And U.S. and Canada are far better off than some of these other countries that are the fragile countries, or the poorer countries in the developing world that don't have the local resources, and certainly they don't have the cash to buy it when petroleum is over $100, $120, $110 a barrel. And it has not just effects on your quote unquote economy, it has effects on what you have at the dinner table. And we might not be seeing it in a desperation quite yet, but there's for instance, I heard on BBC World Service a discussion with a Pakistani who is runs a bureau that manages and doesn't regulate, but monitors Pakistan's mango industry, and they're the world's largest exporter of mangoes, and they're having a heck of a time dealing with fuel prices. And it was a fairly extensive interview. It sounds as if, just a niche. Who cares? Well, a lot of people in Pakistan care. A lot of people around the world like mangoes care, and that's not as critical as wheat and corn, the basic diets of human beings. So, all right, Dan, I've laid out the issue. Ukrainian grain is off the table since the Russians have blocked up all the Ukrainian ports, and it's hard as it can be to move it by rail out of Ukraine. Though I've read that some has been moved, and it's been shipped out through Romania. But Russia has already stolen several silos, thousands of tons of Ukrainian grain, and put them on Russian ships and shipped them out through the Turkish Straits. There's been a little bit of coverage of that. Most of the better coverage I've seen had been in a couple of the British newspapers, but it's been picked up in the U.S. As well, and Ukraine has made extreme, complaint about it. It's theft on top of destruction that Putin's war has brought to Ukraine, and Russia still has been able to ship out some of its grain through its Black Sea ports because Ukraine hasn't bottled them up, and these are on commercial ships, so Turks let them pass. They're not the Turks are only bottled up the Straits under the 1936 Montreux Treaty to the Navy ships, military ships of the belligerents. So Russia's been selling some grain and Ukraine's grain, but its own operations have been affected. So now globally you have higher prices for these staple foods that are essential to human diets. And what's going to be the effect in some of these fragile places that are already on the edge? Political chaos. Yeah, you're gonna see a great deal of disruption, and it will lead to a spike in a place that's already afflicted by small wars, and it's a huge amount of suffering. And again, the critical factor in that has been the fallback position is the World Food Program's ability to provide emergency food, but Ukraine's played a huge part in backing that up, and it isn't available. So we've got an explosive situation. It's been a smaller, containable explosion, but it's affecting large portions of the African continent and key areas of Asia. There'll also be effects peripherally in other areas, even including South America. Even though I hadn't mentioned Argentina, Argentina's another huge agricultural power, but it's one of those. This is looks at it as being a secondary effect of the attack, the invasion of Ukraine, but it has absolutely does primary damage to so many places that aren't part of the major media's focus in this.
Jim, are these effects going to cause violence to start to go up again?
Well, it doesn't start violence in the African countries that are most affected, like Congo, Eritrea, Madagascar, Namibia, Somalia, and Tanzania. Turkey, Egypt has, cash reserves, as it were, supplied by the Arab oil states, so they can compete, they can feed themselves, but they're trying to work up plans to how should I put it, reduce the impact in the future. Turkey, of course, is one of the examples where Russia is using its stolen or its own grain for geopolitical, for diplomatic, and in effect military purposes. Russia can supply Turkey with the additional food it needs, probably at higher prices, but they can't go too high because Turkey is broke. Russian grain has already showed up in Libya, where they are fighting Turkey, well, opposing Turkey. Libya has finally, how should I put it, settled some of their how should I put it, their political problems. But now they're faced with, the presence of a continued presence of Turkey, and Russia's coming in there, basically playing both sides. Hurting Turkey in Libya, helping Turkey at home. Of course, for Turkey, the peace at home is more important than what's going on in Libya. Somalia is another problem. It always has been a problem in Africa. The one reason why there is still a fairly heavy amount of combat in Somalia is because the Al-Shabaab, the Islamic terrorist group, major Islamic terrorist group there, early on realized that food aid was a major military asset if they used it right. In other words, first they charged the food supply groups, as Austin pointed out, distribution is the key, huge taxes to get it into the areas that needed it the most. They also are going to be able to use that more now because the food price has gone up. Now, another problem with the food prices and the food shortage is that many of the Western countries are NATO countries that contributed cash to the World Food Program, and they have cut back fairly heavily on their contribution because a lot of the aid is going to Ukraine, as well as the cost of shifting their energy, supplies from Russia to other sources. That costs money, so they basically have to feed their own people, and at the same time, prepare for the coming winter. So the politicization of food is a major factor. While Yemen is not in Africa, it's right across the straits from from Africa. The Shia rebels that are backed by Iran have long used control of food, and control of the main port on the Red Sea to aid smuggling of Ukrainian weapons and allocating food and not allocating food to groups in their areas they control who are not cooperating. That has become a major problem, and it's getting worse because the food prices have gone up. The only bright point in that area is that the major port that brings in the food to the northern Yemen, where the Iranian forces are in control, is now under the control of the government forces, and of course controlling that is important because that means they can get enough food in to feed the people who need it. They still have a problem getting it to the people in the tribes in Shia-controlled territory that are not cooperating, and that food supply is basically used as a weapon to either get the opposition groups to not actively oppose, or to in some cases to join again the Shia forces that are basically attacking Saudi Arabia and UAE with Iranian missiles and ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and guided rockets. So it's not just a food shortage; it's a how should I put it? It has an impact on the military situation around the world. As Austin pointed out, Africa has long been the major major source of people who are literally either starving or on the cusp of starving. food insecure, as it's described. And that's going to get worse because, again, food prices went up. There's less money allocated for distribution, so you can have less food going in. Somalia, in particular, was going to be hard hurt because they were always on the short list for food supplies because so much of the food was being stolen by the Al-Shabaab, the Islamic terrorists, and they're still doing that. Now they're basically on the defensive, but in areas where they have influence, in other words, where they have armed groups, they are still going to be out there, hijacking food or basically looking for more cash to let it through. But people in Africa are going to suffer. There's going to be less food because it's more expensive, and as it's more expensive, there's more incentive for groups in the affected countries, especially Congo, and believe it now it's Madagascar, where they have a Islamic terrorist uprising going up north.
Mozambique, Jim.
I'm sorry, Mozambique.
Yeah.
And Tanzania is just to the north of there, and Tanzania's been trying to prevent the Al-Shabaab from getting more people and other items into Madagascar, and food is now a weapon to, so to speak, persuade Tanzania to ease off on that. So, it's always been as much a political military weapon as it has been a humanitarian, device. And there's just less of it to go around. Now, what might change things is like those pictures we saw back in the 1990s of literally starving children. One of those pictures, can generate a lot of support. But people have become rather immune to that because, again, a lot of the NGOs that supply the aid are now savvy. They realize they have to respond to the thievery, to the diversion of food aid by the armed groups in these countries or just local politicians. This is another problem. A lot of food aid is distributed with the assent of the local government. NGOs try to get around that, but in some countries, how should I put it? The local power groups are fairly cold-hearted, and they say, "Look, if our people starve, we'll blame it on you." And you have to explain, why we're corrupt and how they're doing it, et cetera, et cetera. But the photos going out, they're easy to blame on the West and the NGOs. The media is the message. So a lot of the crooks have become more media savvy since the 1990s, and so this is already causing disruptions politically and militarily. From Turkey and down into to Africa, and it's only going to get worse the longer this goes on. Now, NATO is aware of this. For example, the Russian control of the Black Sea is relying on about 24 relatively small warships. They lost their battle cruiser, the Moskva, to a Ukrainian attack. The Ukrainians asked the United States to provide Harpoon anti-ship missiles and the GPS-controlled GMLRS, rockets. Now the Russians make these as well. They're not as accurate, but they're accurate enough. And even though our sanctions can basically make it difficult for Russia to produce the longer range ballistic missiles because they need critical components, guidance system components from the West. The simpler, guided rockets, again, like the American GMLRS, which started being used in 2005. That's the only rocket we use. It now has a range of up to over 80 kilometers. Well, the Ukrainians point out that if they have that, they can that and the latest version of Harpoon. They can basically destroy the Black Sea Fleet, and that would enable commerce to resume, or at least make almost eliminate the Russian veto on any shipments they don't approve of coming out of the Black Sea. Now, I think it's Denmark has agreed to basically send some of those long-range Harpoon missiles to Ukraine, and the United States is under pressure, to supply the HMLRS, which the Ukrainians have markedly identified as a shortage. The U.S. position was that, well, no, the MLRS, an attack on their fleet, might escalate the war. Well, you can't escalate it anymore. Putin has said that he's determined to basically gain possession of at least the Donbass and keep the Crimea, something which politically the Ukrainians cannot agree to. I mean, they're taking all these losses. They're seeing their economy devastated, cities blown to pieces. The Russians are now relying on unguided, rockets and artillery to do most of that damage. And they basically cannot, have any assurance of defeating the Russians, without that assistance. Of course, another problem is, I know I'm segueing here, is that NATO has basically run out of supplies of the guided anti-tank missiles, the Javelins, the NLAW, and what have you. And another, how should I put it, sector that is basically gearing up production are the weapons producers, mainly American, but also British and Swedish, to try and replenish those supplies and keep the Ukrainians supplied. So, the food shortages, double back on military operations. It's a vicious circle in Ukraine, because if you can basically get the Russians, defeated or neutralized, bingo, you solved a lot of the food, shortages. But you can't do that unless basically you supply Russia, or supply the Ukrainians with more weapons to basically defeat the Russians. The Russians are basically at the heart of all this. As Austin pointed out, there were food shortages looming for other reasons. And for example, the Russia is a key exporter of certain types of fertilizer. And there's a shortage of that now, and that is causing problems. So it all comes back to Russia. Again, the problem was pretty bad before Russia invaded Ukraine, but since they've done it, it's been exacerbated. So they might also have to, account for, millions of starvation deaths, mainly in Africa, because of their insistence on seizing control of Ukraine. By the way, and we've reported this, there's a lot of opposition in Russia to this. I mean, a lot of Russians figured it out, even though their news until recently was government-controlled news, painted a whole different picture about who was responsible for the war in Ukraine. Between the veterans surviving and news getting in, as it were, through Telegram. That's an encrypted internet app invented, ironically, by a couple of Russians who were forced into exile because the Russians didn't like it. While the Russians tried to exploit it, they have their own pro-Russia, bloggers, as it were, on Telegram. And a lot of these guys have said, look, we cannot keep our any integrity at all if we don't report. And the reporting to the Russian people is just a lot of the bad news in Ukraine is true. We're taking heavy losses. Our commanding officers are making stupid mistakes. A lot of the images that are coming through from Ukraine, which for a while Russia said, oh, they're all staged and what have you. The pro-Russian, Telegram bloggers are basically saying no. Russian soldiers are reporting that it's all true. We're taking a beating, and there's no way out of it unless we stop the damn war. And that means thousands and thousands of Russians are actively, again, in some cases, setting fire to ammunition depots and fuel storage areas that supply the war effort. Recruitment offices. There's a massive increase in draft dodging, which the Russians will punish. They'll send you to jail. But a lot of parents tell their kids, and the kids agree, that it's better to spend a few years in jail, at least until there's a change in government. I mean, Putin's just hanging on by his fingernails, and rather than going to Ukraine and definitely getting killed, because the Russian offensives that they're running now are more cautious, are using more artillery, but a lot of Russians are getting killed. The Ukrainians won't go for that. They're not going to use the suicidal, ground tactics that the Russians have used. They're a lot smarter, and that's why if they get enough of the weapons they need, they will basically beat the Russians without taking heavy casualties, and that means fewer starvation deaths, especially in Africa. I mean, again, most of the other countries can obtain money, to pay the higher prices, even though it means they're going more into debt. And that includes, places like Pakistan, for example. India, in order to avoid a food shortage, they banned exports. They used to be an exporter, not a major one, but they stopped it. And some other countries are doing the same. They say, well, we got to take care of our own people first. But it all comes down to Russia, and a lot of Russians realize it. So there you go.
Putin can't hide it from the Russian farmers, because they know the stuff isn't moving out as fast as it was, and they know something or probably a lot about agriculture around the Black Sea. They know Ukraine, and they're aware of the restrictions that Russia is operating under. It's undeniable. We're even seeing now a few dissidents in the army, retirees, speaking up on Russian national television shows, and they haven't been disappeared. Which is this is old news, about 10 days old. Retired Russian colonel, air defense, who's known intellectual analyst. He was on the most watched talk show in Russia. It's a pro-Putin talk show, and he flat said that this is a mistake, and we're losing, and it's the rest of the world treats Russia as with amusement when we threaten nuclear war. I thought that was an interesting turn of phrase. You've seen some reaction in the West when the Putin waved the nuclear sword, but that's basically, okay, you pull that, then everything's on the table. So when we talk all the other thing too, Dan, talking about, oh, if we send them guided MLRS, we're escalating. Come on, they've already threatened nuclear war. Who's the escalator in this case? Look, Ukraine still has Odessa. If you've got something, as Jim pointed out, clearing out any surface elements of Russian Black Sea Fleet, and I don't know what their submarine situation is, but then Ukraine also laid out a bunch of mines. Some of them become free floating, and Romania and Turkey have swept a few up. And this is old news. This was even happening in March. They came up. They had been cut by the Russians, and they didn't destroy them. Those are an impediment to commercial shipping, and it's this goes back to a strategy talk we had 4 or 5 years ago on talking about what maritime insurance does to global shipping. I think we were talking actually about piracy and Somalia, and piracy in the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean and Arabian Gulf. And maritime insurers aren't going to let you ship because they're not going to insure you. And there are a lot so the ships that are available aren't going to move till the mines are gone, much less the Russian Black Sea Fleet. There are a lot of these nuanced issues that you rarely see addressed, except in especially the specialty press, about how the conflicts that it's secondary, tertiary, to use the words I was using earlier in the podcast, are actually critical to the entire process. And that's when is some sane maritime insurance company, wherever it is, going to permit a Ukrainian vessel loaded with grain that's already sold, absolutely the shipments vital to people in several different places. When are they going to permit it? When you've got not only war but floating mines, and you're in danger at least until you get into Turkish waters.
Well, that brings up another opportunity. One of the plans now for basically opening up Ukrainian Black Sea exports through Odessa. Odessa is near the border of NATO nations, and the plan, of course, if they can basically destroy the surface fleet and the submarine fleet. There aren't many submarines, and they're not. There's only a few, and basically we've been covertly sending maritime patrol aircraft, and we could also, the other plan is you can send in helicopter-based mine clearing systems to be operated from NATO countries and basically if you can clear a lane from from Odessa, which is not very far. This is less than 50, 60 kilometers through Ukrainian waters. Once you hit NATO waters, any Russian interference in NATO waters is an attack on NATO. And now Russia may not be deterred by this. They said, well, you're already participating in the war. But, they said, if you do that, you basically enrage NATO nations already. For example, Finland and Sweden are basically saying, look, we've noticed what's happening in Russia, especially the Finns, who basically have a long border with Russia, and they keep an eye on the Russian garrisons. So those garrisons have been emptied out. There's practically no Russians guarding the Russian border anymore. They're running short of people. They're under a lot of pressure. Now, that doesn't mean Finland's getting ready to attack, but they say, Russian threats against them, are not particularly credible right now. And of course, they point out that what the Russians are worried about up in the Baltic Sea is that once Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, the Baltic Sea becomes a NATO lake. The Russians are basically pinned up, in a small area they control, and they basically have no room to maneuver. That's something Russia wants to avoid. And that, again, gets back to the reason why so many Russians are opposing it. A lot of these Russians, not just in the food industry, they realize that the extent of the sanctions is doing long-term damage to the Russian economy. Yep. A lot of the damage is going to be irreversible because their West European customers are now basically, they no longer trust Russia. Ukraine and the Baltic states already pointed it out to the Western states, the Western nations, that you can't trust Russia. They make a deal. They have no compunctions. If they get a leader like Putin in charge, he'll just rip it all up and say, this was agreed to under duress. Well, all agreements are agreed to under some kind of duress. That's why we have NATO. It's there mainly to defend people from Russia. And the Russians don't seem to get that. Well, a lot of Russians do. They say, well, NATO isn't attacking us. We're attacking NATO. We're attacking Ukraine. We're doing in Ukraine what the Nazis were doing in Ukraine. I mean, they're actually saying that in Russia because they realize it. I mean, a lot of Russians down near the Ukrainian border, they have family in Ukraine, especially in Kharkiv, which has been under siege for months now. The Ukrainians, push the Russians back to the close to the border, and they're still doing it. But the Russians are still basically shelling Kiev to prevent supplies or reconstruction or anything like that going on. And at first, the people in Kharkiv who basically we could still telephone their kin in Russia, the Russians would say no. The other Ukrainians, in Kiev, they're making this up. They're attacking their own people. Now, that's something Russia has been known to do in the past. Putin was accused doing such, staging terrorist attacks in the southern Russia and even in Moscow, bombs going off, which later turned out to be Russian operations, and a number of Russian journalists who tried to investigate and publish, died or otherwise were scared off. So a lot of Russians are fed up, with what their government has turned into. But right now, Putin's still in charge. But as Austin points out, it's not just retired officers who are opposed, fed up, but a lot of guys still in now. He's relieved a lot. He's relieved a lot of senior officers of questionable loyalty. But so far, the ones that are still in are following orders, even if the orders are stupid. That's why you had the air defense colonel, pointing out, and he had a lot of he basically got that from a lot of his active duty buddies, that our hands are tied. We know what we could do to get to some more air superiority over Ukraine, but we have our orders and we have to follow them, or otherwise we're out of a job. And so Putin's burning up what little support he has left, but as long as he's in charge, the war continues, and the long-term damage, the short-term damage to food supplies in countries that desperately need it increases, and of course the damage to the Russian economy and their economic future, declines as well.
Dan, let me make a quick comment though on that NATO littoral route that Jim was outlining to get out of Odessa and then into Romanian, Bulgarian, and Turkish.
Okay,
Turkish
we'll wrap
waters.
up with that.
Snake Island, which is south of Odessa. That was one of the first places the Russians attacked and took. It was where the Ukrainian small local defense force on there told the Moscow to get screwed. Russians still hold that, even though Ukraine has hit it with strike jets, and it's a death trap for them. But that's going to have to be to pull off what Jim described. That's going to have to be completely neutralized. Maybe it has, but it does open that route. Heck, you could, but you're really going to have a lot of costs. You come down there, the mouth of the Danube where it comes out, and then use the Danube to ship it back up all the way through Europe, all the canal system, and then out via the Rhine. But that may sound ludicrous, but it is something I'm sure somebody has looked at. But it could be done, but it would be doable. It's doable, but you've got a lot of diplomacy to do it.
The Ukrainians have admitted that they could do it, but right now they're using it like a one-sided Verdun. The Russians have lost hundreds of troops, half a dozen landing ships and what have you.
Yeah, right.
Trying to get reinforcements and supplies and evacuate wounded, troops on Snake Island. But the Ukrainians said, look, we could just go for taking it back if it suited our purposes. And if NATO gets its act together, that could happen.
Well, all right.
Well, that's a good place to end. It looks like the ramifications of the war in Ukraine could be with us for a long time. And I'm sure we'll be continuing to talk about them. So we'll talk to you gentlemen next time. Have a good weekend.
Take care.